Hi guys, Natalie here. I am ready to talk about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. It's a 1,000-page book my husband and I just finished reading, and it was so great. So to start, just a little bit of background on the book. It was written by Susanna Clarke, who is a British author. It was published in 2004, and it's her debut novel, which is incredibly impressive for how well written it is and the fact that it's a 1,000-page book. This book won the Hugo Award, and it was also number 3 on the New York Times best-selling list and stayed on that list for 11 weeks. So for being a debut novel, this is a pretty dang good book. So now what should you not expect from this book going into it? Well, first off, it's not Harry Potter. The problem with that notion is that yes, this book is about magicians, but it's not Harry Potter at all. In fact, it's entirely the opposite. So don't function under that idea at all. Next point. The book is a pastiche of 19th century writers. So a pastiche is an imitation that celebrates whatever it's imitating, and this book almost immediately reminded me of Jane Austen's writing style. Another aspect of this that makes it super not Harry Potter and very Jane Austen-esque is because it's contrasting and highlighting the supernatural against the mundane. And so a lot of the book, it's not really driven by massive plot events, even though there is a plot going through the entire book. So it really does have that kind of lilting feeling. And finally, you also have footnotes. There's about 200 or so footnotes in this novel, and what's fun about them is that they give you the background of magic, and it's essentially the corpus of magical scholarship as we talk about it and are introduced to it along with the magicians in the novel. Okay, so let's jump into the setting of this book. This book is set in the 19th century during the Napoleonic Wars. That's about 1808 or so to 1816. And think, if you want to situate this time period a little bit better with other literature or other events, think Jane Austen's Persuasion. England and other countries are fighting against Napoleon. You have the high aristocratic society contrasting with low society. You have very prim and proper balls and ladies. We're coming out of the Enlightenment into the Romantic period. That's exactly where this book is set. So the other thing that's important to know about this book is it's categorized in a subgenre called alternative history. Its larger genre obviously is fantasy because it's about restoring magic to England, but being an alternative history, it is a realistic in our world historical setting, like I said, the Napoleonic Wars, but there are very key elements that are changed. So the main premise of this entire book is magic once existed in England, and where did it go? The person who first asked this question and who we're first introduced to in the novel is John Segundus, who is a theoretical magician. He comes to York where there's a gentleman's society of magicians, but they're all just theoretical. They study magic, they study the history of magic, none of them actually practice magic, and they've even convinced themselves that it is not appropriate or suitable to practice magic. And John Segundus says, actually, why don't we have magic anymore? And that kind of starts the ball rolling on the novel. The rest of the novel maintains its propulsion by introducing a prophecy. So the Raven King is the last truly great magician in England, and he's left it, some people believe he abandoned England quite a few hundred years ago. He was a human that was stolen by the fairies, learned of their magic, and became the king of the northern part of England. And he is gone, and so with him went a lot of the magical tradition of England, and he left behind a prophecy that 2 magicians would restore magic to England, and that's where we get Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So now to what I really want to talk about in this book. I'm going to tell you about some of my favorite literary traditions. These are the ones I found in the book that I thought were really cool. So I'm going to start talking about the nature of Englishness. Now this might seem to be kind of weird because English is English, right? Well, maybe. There are a lot of old traditions. There's a lot of history focused right in England specifically and broader the United Kingdom itself. So this book talks a lot about what English is and if a magical revival is necessary to get back to the roots of England and to get back to their truly magical history. My question for you as you read the novel is, do you think that this legendary, mythic, magical quality in the roots of English history isn't necessary for England? And this book looks at it in a very literal way, and it might be an interesting question for you to think about. So the next point is the boundaries between madness and reason. So this is a really interesting question. One of the ways that this book looks at it literally is that the mad, the insane, can communicate and see fairies. So the book very literally says that madness could be a way to understand the underpinnings of our history. At this time period, the 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars, were just coming out of the Enlightenment literary period. And we are just starting to enter the Romantic period, which includes Byron and Shelley and Keats and Jane Austen, Wollstonecraft, the Bronte sisters, those type of authors. And the main difference between those periods is that in the Enlightenment period, they were championing rationality, and they were all for logic. They were all for what makes empirical sense, essentially. And as you move into the Romantic period, people are much more concerned with emotions, reviving sublimity, which is the awesome vastness and closeness to sometimes death, things that strike you. For example, standing on the edge of a mountain peak is sublime, and they're also all for kind of getting back to nature. They don't like industrialism, which is on the horizon. They want to move back to nature, and they want to move back to those things that strike them, the roots, the histories, the magic. The novel itself, we have a reflection of these real literary periods. You have the legitimacy of all these people who are excited and proud to be English because they are the British Empire, and they are rational, and they are secure. And then you have these magicians come in who say, no, we need to revive the magic of this land. We need to revive who we are. We need to revive the old ways. And the issue is not everybody knows if they want the old ways, if they want this romanticism that is so prevalently supported and represented by magic. The next thing that you can look for in this book is, interestingly, the first wave of feminism. One of the most famous writers of this time period was Mary Wollstonecraft, who wanted to have an equality of the sexes that really reflected in things like education. Another representative of first wave feminism, surprisingly for a lot of people, unsurprisingly if you notice the feminist commentary in her books, but Jane Austen. She is definitely more than just a romantic writer, which in and of itself is important because one of the main things she does is she starts to represent women as women. For the first time, we're not hearing about women from a man's perspective, we're hearing about women from a woman. And we're hearing about what's in their minds, and we're hearing about what they're thinking about, and we're hearing about what they deal with in everyday life through these stories that Jane Austen writes. And in this way, we have this feminist movement starting to peak up in this time period, and then in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, we have the disagreement about whether or not women should practice magic. And we have Mr. Norrell's camp that says, no, I know that women practice magic in the history of English magic, but it's not really suitable, it's not appropriate, I don't think women should be able to practice magic at all. Versus Jonathan Strange, who says magic is for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a gentleman, it doesn't matter if you're not, it doesn't matter if you're a woman or a man. Anybody should be able to practice magic. Everybody is capable of practicing magic. The next point that is also subtly included in the novel and is more on the horizon is the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. So the novel ends in about 1816 or 17, so we're about 15 years out, but one of the characters of the novel's name is Stephen Black. He is the servant of Sir Walter Pole, and he is black. Sir Walter Pole is quite a progressive thinker, and so he treats Stephen very well. Stephen has like full reign of the household. He has a lot of responsibility. He's very respected, but he's still black. And over the course of the book, we see that start to bug him more and more. So this book is also within the Gothic fiction category. That means it has some elements of horror, it has definite elements of romanticism, and it's obviously fiction. So if you want to know a little bit more about other Gothic fiction novels, I would suggest starting with the origin novel of the genre, which is The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. It's a little bit weird, but it's definitely it's categorized as one of the first books that really show the tendencies and the patterns of Gothic fiction. After that, I've already talked about a couple other Gothic fiction books in some of my videos. One of them is Dracula by Bram Stoker, another is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and any of Edgar Allan Poe's works also classify as Gothic fiction. You also have the Bronte sisters with Emily Bronte, Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And technically, Jane Austen doesn't fit into this category, even though she was a romantic writer. So it's really interesting that Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is becoming a conglomerate of both patterns. So Susanna Clarke writes and imitates Jane Austen's style, but she has all of the tendencies through her magical premise of Gothic fiction. And the last point I wanted to talk to you guys about today is the comedy of manners. So the comedy of manners is a tradition in drama and fiction and other areas that satirizes or makes fun of a social class with stock type stereotypical characters. And so some you might recognize are the fop, the rake, the glorious boasting soldier. These are just types of people that we sometimes throw into fiction because they reflect a society or a social class in a way that's humorous but incredibly true. And so that's very present in this book. Two of Mr. Norrell's companions and helpers as he tries to wind his way through a society he knows nothing about are Mr. Drawlight and Mr. Lascelles. So Drawlight definitely characterizes as the fop. He's an individual who is overly concerned about his clothes, his manners, what's going on in people's homes, all their gossip, the draperies, the just ridiculous things. But he's also kind of a sneaky man who's really a fool, who nobody likes in their company, but he somehow weasels his way into everybody's company. He is very foppish. So he is quintessentially that character. Similarly, you have Lascelles, who, though a gentleman, is definitely the rake. And the rake is essentially the jerk. It's a man who doesn't mind toying with other women's hearts, and he will have romances with women and drop them. He's a gentleman, but he's a little bit arrogant. That's the rake. And even though Lascelles is not predominantly with tons of different women in the course of the novel, there is one point where his character as the rake is firmly established by a woman telling of how he did her wrong at one point. So what's interesting about their characters is they're pretty annoying throughout the course of the novel, but they're also very telling, and they commentate on the social spheres that they're working within in the course of the novel. But my husband pointed out something that I thought was really interesting. At the end of the book, everybody kind of get their just desserts over the course of the novel. Not that everybody else is a stereotypical character, but what is it about them, and what is it about their ending that seems so fitting? Because one of the things I felt in the novel is when it ended, the last 200 pages were very fast, they were very charged, they were very different from the rather meandering rest of the book. And so what about the ending is so suitable? What wraps up that felt so right to you? And that's one question I would ask yourself as you're reading the book, because the ending is very different from the rest of the book. It's a 1,000-page novel. It's a massive book. And you do just kind of meander through it as you go through the mundane and the interesting and the revival of magic, and get to know all of these characters and all of these interesting circumstances as years pass throughout the course of the novel. And as things come to a close, it's interesting to feel the journey end, but only begin. And do you think it fits? That's a little bit about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. That's a lot of the literary traditions that are present in the book that you can think about as you read it. The premise is super fun, magic in England, alternate history, so it's very plausible, but obviously fiction. And it's written so well. This book has been lauded by amazing individuals. And the fact that it's her debut novel is just astounding. So if you want to jump into a 1,000-page book that is a pleasure from beginning to end, and it's just such a journey of delight, but also intrigue, I would recommend Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell for you. It's definitely a book you need to put in your collection of fantasy reading. And with that, go ahead and go read it. Have fun with it. Think about it and digest it. It's a huge book and it's so worth your time. If you guys want to hear more about books that I've been reading, more about what I think about them, more about how to get into classics, fun books, recommendations, whatever it is, go ahead and subscribe. There will be a button right here, and I'll see you guys later on Novel Thoughts.